This is the Weekly Reader, a weekly literary-based podcast here on Stripped Cover Lit. I'm Adrian Fort. If you appreciate the work I do, hitting the like button really helps me out here, as it tells YouTube to share this with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button, because literature is all I do on this channel. There is also a link to my personal channel to be found in the description below if you want to hear me talk about movies or philosophy or just general YouTubery, etc. And now we have to get to the question of the day. Is literature dead? Is literature dead? And I'm not really talking about the, no one that I read contemporarily is any good type of question. I think probably there are still writers out there carrying on the tradition from Langston Hughes in poetry, from William Faulkner in novels, from Ernest Hemingway in short stories. I am of the opinion that even today there is an Emily Dickinson out there somewhere. Even today there is a William Shakespeare out there somewhere. Someone who is pushing the boundaries of what the technology of writing can do to the human experience. So when I ask, is literature dead, I'm not even really commenting on the quality of writer that exists. Perhaps I am commenting a bit on the quality of writer that gets through. Perhaps I am commenting on the gatekeeping apparatus in literati that be. Maybe I am commenting on that. Maybe I am commenting on the depth of Rupi Kaur versus the depth of Emily Dickinson, but not directly. What you're looking at, what is on the screen in front of you, is the Google Trends for Emily Dickinson, Ernest Hemingway, William Shakespeare, Langston Hughes, and Jane Austen. And yes, there are peaks, there are valleys of this thing, and if you are careful to notice, you can't really see this, but the peaks for Emily Dickinson and William Shakespeare and Langston Hughes happen to be mostly in April of each year. April here in the United States is National Poetry Month, and no, it's not really celebrated, but probably there are plenty of high schools and middle schools around the country that are saying, hey, it's April, this is National Poetry Month, we're going to have a unit on Emily Dickinson, we're going to have a unit on Langston Hughes, we will have to read about William Shakespeare this month. And you will also notice that there are peaks and valleys for Langston Hughes. Some of those happen as well in the month of February here in the United States. That is Black History Month. And then for some reason in December of 2010, interest in Jane Austen peaked. February of 2015, Langston Hughes peaked above even other Februaries. And in April of 2016, William Shakespeare must have dropped a new album, because interest in Shakespeare went through the roof. It is the highest that it has been since January 1, 2004. Now, on the bottom of this graph, you have January 1st, 2004, coincidentally being the year that I graduated high school, but also the year that Google Trends starts keeping track of these things. And I know there could be an automatic rejection of the things that I am showing you. There could be automatically someone saying, but look, Emily Dickinson has been dead for over 100 years. Ernest Hemingway hasn't written a new short story in a very long time. William Shakespeare, much the same. And even then, so for example, Emily Dickinson, the onset of Emily Dickinson mania in the United States was delayed from her death. She died in 1886. The Single Hound was published in 1914. All of the Emily Dickinson that you know of was posthumous, right? For Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises, his first novel, 1926. The last of the real canon novels for Hemingway, A Movable Feast, 1964. Langston Hughes, the most contemporary of these, born in Joplin, Missouri, 1901, died in 1967. Jane Austen, born in 1775, died in 1817, just 41 years old. And William Shakespeare, born in 1564 and died in 1616, allegedly. So I know it's possible to look at these writers and say, well, but why are you picking such old writers? Why aren't you picking something more contemporary? But that's the point. The point is that these are writers who have lived forever. These are writers who will be read 100 years from now, assuming people still know how to read. And this is the most sort of compelling combination of writers that I could come up with that are the greats, that are the everlastings. I had William Faulkner on here. Interest in William Faulkner is nil. I had Robert Frost on here. I believe Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken is the most Googled poem, not only of all time, but the most Googled poem again and again and again and again. Nil. Interest in Robert Frost has been nigh nil. And neither is this perfect from the fact that these are not base numbers. These are not, so for example, the large spike in William Shakespeare there, that is not 100 million Googles being Googled 100 million times. That's not what that is. That is an interest, that is the highest point that the interest in Shakespeare ever has been since 2004. So this is not the most scientific measurement, but I think still it matters. I think still looking at this should be very disheartening. Now, none of these writers right now are at an absolute zero. That's true. And with all things, there will be ebb and wane to interest. That's true. But what you're looking at here, something that people on Wall Street look at, is called higher highs and lower lows. That's how you know if a stock is growing or is shrinking. If, for example, a stock traditionally trades between $40 and $50, 50 being the high, 40 being the low, and all of a sudden that 40 starts being the high and 30 starts being the low, and then that 30 starts being the high and that 20 begins to be the low, that is a stock on a downward spiral right now, going all the way back to 2004. Literature is on a downward spiral. If you had invested $100 in William Shakespeare all the way back in 2004, here in 2023, it seems you would be left with about $23. You would rightfully be pretty upset. I have also tried to be fair with selecting what types of writing these are. Emily Dickinson, William Shakespeare, and Langston Hughes, very, very prominent poets. Ernest Hemingway, very prominent short story writer as well as novelist. Jane Austen, extremely well-known novelist. William Shakespeare, poetry and playwright. And yes, I consider myself something of a torchbearer for literature. Otherwise, I would not have started and run for so long a YouTube channel on literature. I would not have an English literature degree, a bachelor's degree. I would not have a master's in creative writing. I would not be doing those things if I did not believe that literature itself was very, very important. And when you ask yourself, what is literature? What does literature mean? What does it do? What do we use it for? What is the utility of literature? Well, simply put, the most simply that I can think to explain it, and please in the comments correct me if I am wrong, literature is how we find ourselves. So, for example, I recently did a video on the channel for The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber. Now, you could read The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber at 20. It will be a different short story than if you were 27 versus if you were 35 versus here I am now at 37 years old, and it is a very different short story than ever have I read it to be. That short story itself has never changed. It's the same short story. I have changed, and because of how I have changed, my observations in the short story move. Sometimes I am extremely judgmental of Francis Macomber. Other times, that's not Francis Macomber's world. That's not where he's from. That's not what he's supposed to do. He's the guy in the middle here. You have Margot, his wife, judging him harshly, and you have Wilson, the hunter, also judging him harshly on something that, why does he need to know how to shoot lions? It doesn't make any sense. Other times, I am very partial to Wilson. I really enjoy that character. Now, that changes based on who I am, not what the words are. Literature is where we go to define ourselves. Literature is a tool, a very powerful tool in the personality building toolkit. Another pretty stark example of this, around the time I was in college, The Walking Dead, the comic book, was becoming a very big deal. And one of the observations that the writer of The Walking Dead himself had made was that the real reason The Walking Dead as a phenomenon is interesting, the real reason that most horror, that most especially zombie stories, especially zombie apocalypse stories are interesting, is that they are a blatant exploit of the fact that no matter what the circumstance really might be, it's other people who are the true monsters. If you read The Walking Dead, the worst things that happen at the hands of other people. And that's an extremely interesting way to look at the series. But if you don't want to read it that way, if you just want to read it as sort of schlock, if you just want to read The Walking Dead as top-of-the-mind horror, it's very easy to do that. You don't have to bring in an analytical eye. One thing that I have always said is that an absolute fool can sit down with William Shakespeare and say, oh, there it is. There is the literature. There is that good stuff. There it is. That's what literature is. But an extremely astute individual could sit down with this week's funnies, pick out Garfield, and tell you why that Garfield comic strip represents each and every one of us. That is the type of mental activity that can happen in literature. It doesn't take a genius to look at Shakespeare and say, yeah, there's everyone represented in there. But if you can take the Sunday funnies and do it, then it says a little something more about the intellectual propensity of the individual, of the explainer in that moment. So yes, I believe that literature is extremely important for that reason, because individuals are what creates culture, are what creates societies. Individuals are how we go about a responsible life. Be responsible for the individual that is you, and if you are responsible enough to do that, you can reach out and help other people up along the way. The individual is the most important facet of society. When you look back at how society has progressed, we can go all the way back to Egypt. We can go all the way back to Imhotep. Before Imhotep, however you say it, before Imhotep, intelligence was just a rumor. Imhotep was basically what we know now as the first genius on record. That one guy pushed society forward millennia. Everyone else had to do their part along the way. But that one guy did so much. What literature helps a society, a culture to do is create more individuals. more people capable of seeing the world from multiple points of view, seeing the world in multiple ways. Only by seeing the world in multiple ways can we envision multiple solutions, because not every solution works. So, more individuals seeing more solutions helps society along. And look, I'm not here to be political. I'm not going to be political. I'm not going to start that here. I promise you that. But if you really look at these numbers, a lot of this starts around 2014. There is a huge drop-off in basically everything here after those dates. Whatever it is with this culture war stuff, whatever all of that stuff is, whatever it is, it has not been good for literature. It has not been good for individualization on either side of things. Collectivist mindsets snuff out the individual. Once the individual has been sufficiently snuffed out, everything about individuation can be policed. Oh, what are you reading over there? That's not the right type of novel. That's not the right type of poetry. You shouldn't be reading that. Here's a list of approved books and authors. And again, not getting political here, but it has been interesting to see, I believe over the last year or so, there have been a great number of individuals who are not really all that centered around books start talking more about books. But something very, very interesting happened shortly thereafter. Now, in January of 2022, Ben Shapiro, noted right-wing conservative commentator, launched, he of 6.18 million subscribers, launched what he was calling a book club. What I believe was one of the first discussions in that book club was on George Orwell's 1984. That video, 698,000 views. Very, very big deal. 698,000 views on a book review for 1984 by George Orwell. Now, 698,000 views for a guy that has 6.18 million subscribers, not the highest engagement. By November of that year, he dropped a review on Brave New World, which ended up with 132,000 views. Now, that's 10 months fewer of watch time accumulated here on YouTube. I understand that. But that doesn't compute. That engagement is nowhere near what it was for his review of 1984. So that January, when he dropped 1984 and saw 698,000 views, that's not great. But if you have a mission statement, and part of your mission statement is perpetuation of literature, then I can understand making the sacrifice for something that is going to have more future potential for views, something like a book review, than I believe Ben Shapiro normally has. I think he normally just covers the news, right? Then maybe you make that sacrifice initially and you allow that video to accumulate views. Even Brave New World, I gave you the numbers for that, 132,000 in November, but that's a huge fall off. But March of that year, January, February, March of that year, Ben Shapiro made a video about A Tale of Two Cities that to this day has less than 76,000 views. 76,000 views on a channel with 6.18 million subscribers. And upon searching his channel in preparation for this video, it appears to me Ben Shapiro no longer makes book videos. Maybe I'm wrong. It appears to me that he has dropped the subject. Similarly, Lex Friedman in January of this year, made a book review for 1984 by George Orwell. Interesting because it is the same book that Shapiro covered in January of 22. A year later, Lex Friedman made a book review for 1984 that right now has 1.4 million views on 3.16 million subscribers for Lex Friedman, a much higher engagement rate. And around that time, if anyone, so I don't follow Ben Shapiro. I do follow loosely Lex Friedman. Anyone who remembers around that time, Lex Friedman was also putting out a reading list that he was planning to read during this year. And ostensibly, one would imagine that if he were sticking with that reading goal, the reading goals that he had set for himself, which were very aggressive, and there was almost no way he was going to follow through with that entire list. I will concede that. But one would imagine that if he had stuck on that path, we would have seen more book reviews along the way if those videos had proven as fruitful as could they have been. To this date, from what I can tell on Lex Friedman's channel, he has dropped one book review, 1984 by George Orwell. That is it. In fact, buttoned up Lex Friedman to this day, Lex Friedman has more videos in his video game playlist than book reviews, making even Lex Friedman closer to PewDiePie than he is to the literati. Now, I'm not saying that you have to enjoy or support or watch Lex Friedman or Ben Shapiro. All I'm doing is giving you the numbers attached to those ideas, attached to those channels. They're not great. No one is watching videos based on literature. Essentially, what you could be doing through this is getting an education, assuming that you trust Ben Shapiro's or Lex Friedman's compass when it comes to literature, and I'm not suggesting that you do, but surely their followers do. Their followers feeling that these are individuals worth listening to, seeing that they dropped a video on a book, a prevalent book in 1984, not a very long book. A standard print edition with the afterword is just 326 pages. But between the two of them, a collective about 10 million subscribers, they couldn't justify to themselves, to their income stream, to their audience, to what it means to them on the YouTube platform. They could not justify to themselves to continue reading and talking about literature. That is devastating. So, for example, with Lex Friedman, that 1.4 million views on 1984 from 8 months ago. Also, from 8 months ago, Lex Friedman had an interview with, ironically, Ben Shapiro, 7.1 million views. With Destiny, the political commentator on YouTube, 1.6 million views. With Fiona Hill, 1.9 million views. Andrej Karpathy, the AI expert, formerly of Tesla, 1.7 million views. With Kanye West, 4.8 million views. If those are the views that you're grabbing in, and all of a sudden you drop a video that has just 1.4 million views, YouTube absolutely destroys you in the algorithm. So you can't afford to do it. And by the way, the video that Lex Friedman put out on 1984, extremely well done. It has sections. It has quotes on the screen. There's history. I mean, it's very well done. Say what you want about Lex Friedman or anything. The video itself has a higher production value than basically anything you're going to find on this corner of the internet. So if people with those platforms, collectively 10 million subscribers, cannot reach down and justify what it would mean to resurrect literature in some meaningful form, at least as far as following is concerned, do we have a chance? What would it mean or look like to have a chance. I fear that a great big part of it is literature ostracizing itself. Recently, I dropped a video where I was announcing two series, the Ernest Hemingway read-along series as well as this series here, and we get this comment from Will. Will, I hope you don't mind me sharing this. Quote, "At first, whenever I see a CTA or clickbait-style headline of 'Literature is Dead,' it seems to be exactly that. However, having recently read Shuggie Bain, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, working my way through Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine, and next up, The House in the Cerulean Sea, it seems to be. How can current literature not be built standing on the shoulders of the previous giants and yet receive such plaudits? It all appears to be playing to the gallery, and the audience are increasingly losing mental alacrity and elasticity." End quote. I think that's a lot of it. I think, unfortunately, regrettably, a lot of it is the fact that with most writing, there simply is not anything there for most people. Now, you heard me mention earlier in this video Rupi Kaur, author of Milk and Honey, author of The Sun and Her Flowers, author of You'll Come Back to Yourself. These are books... I took the time to read some of this poetry. To me, it's absolute garbage. To me, it's trash. And I do not say that to offend anyone. I do not say that because of jealousy or anything of the sort. I think it is 100% disposable. That said, what Rupi Kaur is doing is very, very important. So I'll speak for myself. Myself, personally, I did not come from a place of great wealth. Never in my life was I ever supposed to have the opportunity to go to college, let alone get such a throwaway degree as English literature. But I'll tell you this, without Emily Dickinson, some of her easier poems, but without Emily Dickinson, without Chuck Palahniuk, I never would have understood Shakespeare. I never would have understood Hemingway. I certainly wouldn't have understood William Faulkner. We all need these stepping stones along the way. And maybe Rupi Kaur has everything that there is to find in Emily Dickinson, and I just turn up my nose and don't see it there. Maybe it's there. Maybe. I'll be willing to concede if it is proven to me otherwise. But to me, right now, her poetry is basically a great big wooden live, laugh, love sign. But if there are a host of young women reading that big wooden live, laugh, love sign enough times that eventually they end up falling in love with Sylvia Plath and William Blake, by God, it's worth it. And then they can ramble on with their newfound William Blake and Sylvia Plath tools about their Rupi Kaur poems the same way that I come to YouTube multiple times a week just to talk about Emily Dickinson. Is literature dead? I'm afraid it might be. And so we must take it upon ourselves, you and I, to be the voodoo shaman, to raise that zombie out of the ground and parade it about town where, instead of eating brains, that zombie will slowly start to help people grow their brains. And now it's time for the poem of the week. And as this is episode 1 and I am starting something new here, and as we have already talked in depth about Emily Dickinson, I am going to read to you not only my favorite Emily Dickinson poem, but also the Emily Dickinson poem that got it started for me. This was my very first poem from Emily Dickinson my sophomore year in high school. I died for beauty, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb, when one who died for truth was lain in an adjoining room. He questioned softly why I failed. For beauty, I replied, and I, for truth, themself are one, we brethren are, he said. And so, as kinsmen met a night, We talked between the rooms until the moss had reached our lips and covered up our names. Now, it is a matter of law. You can look this up in your local jurisdiction that poem, I Died for Beauty, by Emily Dickinson, is the greatest poem of all time, universally recognized by all people that matter, all civilizations, all workers' unions, even the third greater voodoo shaman organization in Kansas City, Missouri. Very prestigious poetic organization. They host readings every first Thursday of the month at the UAW building down on North Oak. Really, I just think that's a beautiful poem. To have died for beauty and to have died for truth, and then the two can confer between themselves. They talk, they understand each other, and they are friends until the moss reached their lips, stopping their speech. And then the moss covered up their names, joining them as one. Beauty and truth. Are beauty and truth the same thing? Are they the same thing to you? What is the beautiful? And you don't have to use the comment section to say that I am, in fact, beautiful. But if you do, I won't argue. What is beautiful? And what is true? 1 + 1 is 2. That's true. Is it beautiful? The Mona Lisa. Extremely beautiful painting, though it's somewhere in the middle of Leonardo's work, if you ask me. Still, Leonardo's work, very beautiful painting. The Mona Lisa. Is the Mona Lisa a type of truth? If these things are not, in fact, synonymous, what kind of lie could be beautiful? What type of ugliness would we wish to be true? A bit of a loaded question, I understand, but humor ourselves. And now for the passage of the week again, the first episode. Here comes a passage from what could rightfully be called my first favorite book, that is, Fight Club from Chuck Palahniuk. Quote, "Since Fight Club, the mechanic guy is always hanging around the house on Paper Street. Wants me to hear the song he wrote. Wants me to see the birdhouse he built. The guy showed me a picture of some girl and asked me if she was pretty enough to marry. Sitting in the front seat of the Cornish, the guy says, 'Did you see the cake I made for you? I made this. It's not my birthday. Some oil was getting by the rings,' the mechanic says, 'but I changed the oil and the air filter. I checked the valve lash and the timing. It's supposed to rain tonight, so I changed the blades. I ask, what's Tyler been planning?' The mechanic opens the ashtray and pushes the cigarette lighter in. He says, 'Is this a test? Are you testing us? Where's Tyler?' The first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club,' the mechanic says. And the last rule about Project Mayhem is you don't ask questions. So what can you tell me? He says, what you have to understand is your father was your role model for God. Behind us, my job and my office are smaller, gone. I sniff the gasoline on my hands. The mechanic says, if you're male and you're Christian and living in America, your father is your role model for God. And if you never know your father, if your father bails out or dies or is never at home, what do you believe about God?' This is all Tyler Durden dogma, scrawled on bits of paper while I was asleep and given to me to type and photocopy at work. I've read it all. Even my boss has probably read it all. What you end up doing, says the mechanic, is you spend your life searching for Father and God. What you have to consider, he says, is the possibility that God doesn't like you. Could be God hates us. This is not the worst that can happen. How Tyler saw it was that getting God's attention for being bad was better than getting no attention at all. Maybe because God's hate is better than his indifference. If you could choose, if you could be either God's worst enemy or nothing, which would you choose? We are God's middle children, according to Tyler Durden, with no special place in history and no special attention. Unless we get God's attention, we have no hope of damnation or redemption. Which is worse, hell or nothing? Only if we're caught and punished can we be saved. Burn the Louvre, the mechanic says. Wipe your ass with the Mona Lisa. This way, at least God would know our names. End quote. That same energy is throughout Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk. Maybe you wouldn't like it, maybe you wouldn't even enjoy it, but regardless of that, Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk is definitely worth a read. The writing style is at the same time coarse and irreverent. There is intellectualism and especially pseudo-intellectualism at play. And I contend that it is like nothing you've ever read before. That is all I have for this episode 1 of The Weekly Reader. If you have suggestions as to other segments I should include or other questions I should ask for The Weekly Reader, please leave them in the comments section below. If you appreciate what I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out on the channel, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button in order to stick around for more. I hope to have you back for the next one.